What if the past isn't missing by accident, but by the simple, ordinary way humans choose what to remember? Picture a museum storage room you'll never see. Not the bright halls with school groups and polished plaques, but the back corridors, unlabeled drawers, anonymous crates, shelves stacked with silence. Most of what a culture owns is never displayed, not because it's secret, usually because there isn't space or time or consensus about what it means. Now widen the frame. Imagine the desert at dawn, the kind of pale light that turns stone into skin. A monument sits under that light, old enough that we treat it like a law of nature. Tourists circle, guides recite, cameras click, and underneath, in the cool dark, the ground holds its own version of the story, undisturbed by applause. The strange thing about history is that it's both sturdy and fragile. Sturdy because it's built from dates, ruins, documents, and carbon readings. Fragile because every one of those things requires an interpreter, a scientist to calibrate, a curator to catalogue, a journal to accept, a government to grant access, a public to care. Most of what becomes true is simply what survives the long chain of permission. This is not an accusation. It's a human fact. We all know how memory works. You don't keep every moment from your childhood. You keep the ones that fit the person you became. The rest fade, not because they're false, but because they no longer have a place to live. Civilizations do something similar. Sometimes a discovery arrives like a pebble, tossed into a calm pond. Small at first, then rippling outward. A survey reveals an anomaly. A fossil appears in the wrong layer of earth. A carved object suggests knowledge that seems to belong to another century. The moment is thrilling, even intoxicating, because it offers what we secretly crave, the sense that the world is larger than we were told. And then the hard part begins, because wonder isn't the same as understanding, and extraordinary claims demand extraordinary care. The past is crowded with mistakes, misread measurements, misidentified bones, forged artifacts, legends inflated by repetition. The responsible mind holds the spark of curiosity in one hand and a lamp of skepticism in the other. Still, there's a quieter truth beneath the caution. Even when evidence is real, it can be lost. Not always burned or stolen. Sometimes it is boxed up, filed away, and forgotten. Sometimes it becomes too expensive to study, too politically tangled to excavate, too embarrassing for institutions built on older conclusions. Sometimes the people who found it run out of money, or time, or allies. Sometimes the story simply doesn't fit the shelf it's supposed to sit on. In this series, we're going to walk through 10 claims, 10 hidden discoveries that have haunted the edges of modern storytelling. Tales of metallic shapes under ancient stone, human bones in impossibly old rock, crystal artifacts with craftsmanship that seems to resist explanation, ancient electrical devices and underground complexes, strange libraries, erased sites, vanishing collections. We will not treat these stories as verdicts. We will treat them as questions. Some may turn out to be exaggerated, misunderstood, or stitched together from fragments. Some may carry a kernel of truth surrounded by rumor. Some may simply be mirrors, reflecting our hunger for mystery more than any actual mystery itself. But even that hunger is worth studying. Because the real subject here isn't a gadget under sand or a skull carved from quartz. It's us, the way we build timelines, the way we defend them, the way institutions and individuals react when the world refuses to stay inside the shape we've drawn for it. History, at its best, is not a monument. It's a conversation across time, full of revisions and humility. And sometimes, the most honest thing we can say about the past is not, "This is what happened," but "This is what we can currently see." So let's begin with the first shadow under the stone. If you stood at the edge of an ancient monument and listened closely enough, past the tourism, past the certainty, what would you hear? And would you recognize the sound if the ground answered back? It started as a rumor you could almost feel in your teeth, a low, persistent vibration beneath one of the most photographed structures on Earth. Stand on the Giza Plateau in the early morning, and the air does something strange. Heat hasn't yet climbed into the stone, so the world feels sharp-edged, like a black and white film. The pyramids aren't just big, they're patient. They sit there with the calm of something that expects to outlast your questions. And yet, for decades, people have asked the same one anyway. What's underneath? Not the well-documented chambers and passages already known. Not the tourist routes, the guarded corridors. Something else. Voids, cavities, hidden rooms, spaces that don't appear on the tidy diagrams printed in books. In the late 20th century, new tools gave old curiosity a more precise vocabulary, techniques that could see through stone, not with fantasy, but with particles, with sensors, with the slow accumulation of signal and noise. When researchers began to map the Great Pyramid in ways earlier generations couldn't, they found hints that the monument was not fully accounted for, not fully read. A gap doesn't sound like much, a void, an empty space. But in a structure built with obsessive intent, emptiness becomes evidence. The public imagination does what it always does. It rushes in ahead of the facts. The void becomes a vault. The vault becomes a library. The library becomes a legend. An archive of ancient knowledge waiting to correct everything we think we know about time. What's complicated is that the emotional engine behind the legend isn't foolish. It's human. Because we all recognize the feeling of being certain something is missing without being able to name it. It's the feeling you get when you revisit a childhood home and notice a door that was always there, but you never truly saw. Or when you read an old letter and realize the most important sentence is the one that isn't written. A void invites projection. It becomes a screen for whatever the viewer longs to find. But step back from the fever of speculation and the real story is still astonishing. The pyramid remains, in some respects, an unsolved engineering text. We know the broad strokes: quarrying, hauling, alignments, labor organization, ritual purpose. Yet every new scan reminds us that certainty can be a costume history wears, not a permanent condition. If there is a hidden chamber, it might be practical, a relieving space meant to reduce stress, a structural solution disguised as mystery. It might be ceremonial, an area reserved for rites we barely understand. It might be nothing more than the architectural equivalent of a pause, an intentional silence in stone. And still, even that, nothing matters. Because the question isn't only what the void contains, it's what the void does to us. It pulls us into a tension between two kinds of humility. The humility of science, which says, we must verify, and the humility of wonder, which says, we don't have the whole story. In a world trained to demand instant answers, archaeology moves at the speed of responsibility. Permissions are negotiated. Funding is assembled. Instruments are calibrated. Interpretations are debated. Researchers choose their words carefully because history isn't just an academic puzzle. It's heritage, identity, politics, tourism, pride. That careful pace can look like secrecy from the outside. Sometimes it is. More often, it's the fragile process of not breaking what you're trying to understand. But the suspicion persists because it touches an old nerve, the fear that knowledge is always being kept just out of reach, not by villains, but by systems, by bureaucracy, by the simple fact that not everyone gets to stand where the truth is being measured. And so the pyramid becomes what it has always been, more than a tomb, more than an artifact, a mirror. If you want it to be a monument of human labor and ingenuity, it is. If you want it to be a doorway to forgotten chapters, it becomes that too. The stone does not change. We do. In the end, the hidden space beneath Giza, real, rumored, or misunderstood, asks a question bigger than itself. When we stare at the past and demand that it reveal its secrets, are we searching for evidence? Or are we searching for permission to believe the world still holds surprises worthy of our awe? The desert is honest in a way cities aren't. It doesn't keep many secrets on the surface. The wind scrapes, the sun bleaches, the sand rearranges itself like a patient editor. If something remains, it's because stone can endure what flesh cannot. That's why the next story begins far from museum lights, in a place where the ground seems too simple to contain anything complicated. A miner, a laborer, a person whose name might never make it into a textbook, strikes rock and finds something that shouldn't be there. Not a fossil shaped like a fern. Not an ancient shell. Something worked. Something made. These are the moments that sit at the heart of so many hidden discovery legends, a human artifact found in a geological layer that appears too old for humans to have made it. A hammer encased in stone. A metallic object lodged in coal. A footprint pressed into ancient sediment, hardened into a kind of accusation. There is an immediate thrill in these stories because they tug at the simplest timeline most of us carry. First came the earth, then came life, then came us. Late arrivals, clever but recent. An object out of place is a challenge. It whispers, maybe we weren't late. Maybe we have forgotten ourselves. But the earth is not a neat filing cabinet. Layers can be disturbed. Stone can form around modern objects. Mineral deposits can cement things in decades, not millennia. Geological context can be misunderstood by non-specialists or simplified in retellings until it becomes myth. And yet, here's what's worth holding on to. The tension itself is real. Because in every generation, a small number of finds do force science to redraw its lines, not with drama, with footnotes, with careful recalibration. Earlier than we thought, more widespread than assumed, multiple migrations, unexpected sophistication. Those phrases don't make sensational headlines, but they change the story of humanity anyway. The danger is that when we crave a grand reversal, we become vulnerable to easy certainty. We want the artifact to prove what we already suspect, that history is hiding something, that we've been misled, that the world is stranger than the experts admit. Sometimes the experts are wrong. Often they are simply cautious, and caution can feel like denial to an impatient audience. Imagine holding a stone that contains a metal shape. In your palm, it feels like evidence. The mind wants to leap. Ancient technology, lost civilization, erased chapter. But responsible curiosity asks slower questions. What is the object made of? Can it be dated directly, or only the surrounding material? Could the surrounding material have formed later? Is there documentation of where it was found, who handled it, how it was stored, whether contamination occurred? Has it been studied independently? Has the chain of custody remained intact? In the realm between discovery and verification, stories can drift. A photograph circulates without context. A claim becomes a headline. A headline becomes a documentary. A documentary becomes a fact, repeated in confident voices. And by the time a geologist or archaeologist explains a mundane explanation, the myth has already found a home. But the myth persists because it speaks to a deeper ache, the sense that our species is always arriving at the scene after the important part has happened. We look at ancient architecture and feel small. We look at deep time and feel brief. We look at the stars and feel peripheral. An out-of-place artifact offers an antidote. The idea that humans have been here longer, achieved more, fallen and risen again. That we are not just a recent accident, but part of a repeating story. Whether that repeating story is true is another question, but the longing behind it is unmistakable. And there's a quiet irony. Even if the object is modern, even if the tale is inflated, it still teaches something real about how knowledge spreads. It shows how easily context can be separated from content, how an object can become a symbol detached from the soil that birthed it. In the end, the most honest thing we can say about these impossible artifacts is this: they are invitations. An invitation to study the Earth's complexity without romantic shortcuts. An invitation to treat wonder as a beginning, not a conclusion. An invitation to accept that the past is not a straight road, but a braided river with channels that shift, disappear, and reappear. So when you hear of a hammer in stone or metal in coal, don't ask only, is it true? Ask something deeper. If it were true, what would it change in the way we see ourselves, and why do we want that change so badly? It's easier to believe in secrets when the secret has a face. The Great Sphinx does. It has watched the sun rise and fall so many times that we speak of it the way we speak of elders, half with reverence, half with a childlike hope that it might finally tell us what it knows. So when people whisper about something beneath its paws, they don't whisper like they're discussing rocks. They whisper like they're discussing a locked door. The modern version of the story often begins in the language of instruments: ground-penetrating radar, subsurface anomalies, shapes that don't match the natural layering of limestone, a pattern that looks too clean, too geometric, too intentional to be random. To the public imagination, those words translate instantly into a single image: a buried machine. Not a metaphorical machine, a literal one. A metallic structure, a relic of engineering tucked beneath the Sphinx as if placed there on purpose, waiting for the right century to be found. Depending on who tells it, the story includes abrupt interference, permits revoked, equipment seized, researchers escorted away, warnings issued. That last detail is always the spark, because if someone stops you from digging, the mind assumes there must be something worth hiding. Here's the problem. Archaeology is full of stoppages that have nothing to do with conspiracies. A site can be closed for safety, for preservation, for politics, for jurisdiction disputes between agencies, for tourism schedules, for funding, for international relations, for the simple reality that a monument that old can't be treated like an empty lot. And yet, even acknowledging that, the emotional force remains. The rumor persists because it rests on a plausible foundation. There are, in fact, cavities and tunnels around Giza. There have been surveys. There are ongoing debates about what is natural, what is carved, what is repaired, what is still unknown. The ground is complex. The record is incomplete. When an instrument sees something underground, it doesn't see a picture, it sees a signal. It sees differences in density, moisture, conductivity, shadows in data that must be interpreted. A rectangular-looking void can be a chamber, or it can be fractured rock. A metallic-like response can come from minerals, from modern debris, from reinforcements added in restoration, from something as simple as the way the instrument couples to the ground. The sober truth is less cinematic, but more honest. Subsurface imaging produces possibilities, not conclusions. Still, this legend points to something real about the way humans treat ancient places. We want them to be more than what they are. We want them to contain a message. If you're raised in a world where technology changes every year, it's difficult to accept that the deepest marvels of the past might be human hands, stone, rope, organization, and faith. Those things are astonishing, but they don't satisfy the part of us that wants the past to be a coded transmission from an earlier, higher intelligence. So the Sphinx becomes a kind of metaphor with teeth. On one side, the Sphinx is a triumph of ancient craftsmanship, weathered yet enduring, a reminder that human beings, without modern machines, could shape the world with patience and purpose. On the other side, the Sphinx becomes a container for our suspicion that history is curated, and that what we're allowed to know is always smaller than what exists. Both are stories about control. The machine under the paws idea is less about metal and more about the desire for revelation. We want the past to flip over a card and show us something that instantly reorganizes our modern anxieties, that we're too late, too forgetful, too shallow, too temporary. A hidden structure promises the opposite: continuity, depth, and the possibility that knowledge can survive disaster, buried and waiting. If you've ever felt the urge to lift a floorboard in an old house just to see what's beneath, you already understand the impulse. But the more mature question is not, what are they hiding? It's this: if a discovery beneath a monument could change the story of civilization, who gets to decide when we're ready to hear it? And what happens if the truth is not a single answer, but a long, difficult conversation? Not all mysteries are buried. Some are held up to the light and still refuse to explain themselves. Imagine a room where the air is cool and carefully controlled. A single object rests behind glass, lit like a confession. Visitors lean in, trying to catch the exact point where beauty becomes impossibility. It's shaped like a skull, clear, precise, unnervingly lifelike. Every curve suggests intent. Every angle suggests patience. It doesn't look carved so much as grown, as if the crystal learned the anatomy of a human head and decided to imitate it. Stories gather around it the way moths gather around a porchlight. Some say it is ancient, older than the civilizations that claim it, a relic from a vanished culture, a ceremonial object, a tool for healing, a lens for visions, something that remembers what we cannot. And then come the warnings, that it was hidden, that it was suppressed, that those who studied it too closely became obsessed, that institutions quietly moved it out of sight when its presence became inconvenient. But before we chase those shadows, we should pause on what is actually true about objects like this. Craftsmanship can be astonishing even when it's modern, and unexplained is often just another word for not yet fully documented. Crystal is not forgiving. It fractures, it chips, it holds its own internal faults like frozen lightning. To shape it into a skull-like form requires skill and time, and, depending on the tools used, leaves traces that specialists can sometimes read like fingerprints. This is where the story becomes a deeper kind of drama, because it's not only about the object, it's about the war between two human instincts. One instinct says, if something feels ancient, it must be ancient. If something inspires awe, it must come from a lost golden age. Mystery itself becomes proof. The other instinct says, no matter how beautiful, no matter how strange, we must ask for provenance. Where did it come from? When was it first recorded? Who owned it? What chain of custody connects it to a real excavation instead of a market stall? In the modern world, artifacts don't just travel through time. They travel through economics, through collectors, through wars, through colonial histories, through the appetite of wealthy buyers and the survival strategies of those who supply them. That's not cynicism, it's history. And when an object's story is stitched together after the fact, when it appears suddenly, attached to vague claims and dramatic origin tales, it becomes difficult to separate what is real from what was invented to make it valuable. Still, even if a crystal skull is modern, it remains meaningful, not as proof of a lost super-civilization, but as evidence of our own hunger, our desire to touch something that feels larger than us, our suspicion that the world has been edited. Because think about what a skull is. It's an object we all carry without seeing. It's the architecture of our identity. It's the hard shell of consciousness holding our soft thoughts in place. A skull made of crystal turns that hidden structure outward. It makes the unseen visible. It makes mortality shine. So the myth swells. A crystal skull becomes a library, a transmitter, a key. And perhaps that's the real function of such objects, regardless of age. They are keys to the mind. They unlock storytelling. They give shape to a question that won't leave us alone. If we could hold the past in our hands, perfect, transparent, and whole, would we finally understand ourselves? Or would we simply project our longing into it, the way we do with everything we can't fully explain? The glass case doesn't answer. It only reflects your face back at you, faintly superimposed over the crystal. Two skulls, one living, one silent. And somewhere between them, the mystery persists. Are we searching for evidence of forgotten knowledge? Or are we searching for a way to make our own fragile lives feel connected to something enduring? Sometimes the most unsettling thing isn't a strange object. It's a familiar idea appearing too early. Picture a small clay vessel, not much larger than a hand. It doesn't look like a miracle. It looks like something that could be ignored until someone notices the pattern. A container inside a container, metal and ceramic arranged in a way that suggests a purpose beyond storage. A simple question follows. What if it's a battery? The thought is both thrilling and uncomfortable because it doesn't require aliens or mythic continents. It only requires this, that practical knowledge can appear, disappear, and reappear in human societies without leaving a clean trail. The story has traveled under many names, but the heartbeat is the same. An ancient device discovered in the soil of the Middle East, dated to a time when we don't typically imagine electrical experimentation. A jar, a rod, a sleeve, components that, assembled with an acidic liquid, could potentially produce a small voltage. Even the smallest voltage is enough to rearrange your assumptions. Because electricity feels modern. It belongs to wires and streetlights, to labs and power plants. We think of it as a bright dividing line between then and now. But nature doesn't care about our categories. Lightning existed long before language. Static sparks flickered on fur and cloth long before anyone knew the word for charge. If humans are curious, and we are, then someone, somewhere, might have tried to capture a tiny piece of that phenomenon, not to light a city, but to solve a humble problem. The theories branch quickly. Maybe it was used for electroplating, to coat small objects in metal. Maybe it played a role in rituals, producing a faint tingle that felt like the touch of a god. Maybe it wasn't a battery at all, but a container with an entirely different purpose that only resembles one when modern eyes look at it. The truth might be less romantic than any of these. But what matters is the question it forces into the open. How much ancient technology do we underestimate because we assume the past must be simpler than the present? We forget that ancient people were not ancient minds. They were people. They argued. They experimented. They improved techniques through repetition. They noticed patterns. They made mistakes. They tried again. And yet, it's also true that a clever interpretation can be tempting. When we want a mystery to be real, we can fit evidence into a shape it doesn't truly match. A jar becomes a circuit. A coincidence becomes a blueprint. That's why this story sits on a knife edge between possibility and projection. Because even if the device can generate electricity in a demonstration today, that doesn't prove it was intended for that purpose then. And even if it was intended, it doesn't automatically rewrite civilization. It would simply mean that a small corner of practical knowledge existed, perhaps briefly, perhaps locally, then faded, as many skills do when the people who hold them die or migrate or lose access to materials. The fragile truth of history is that knowledge is not guaranteed to survive. A society can know how to do something and still lose it. A craft can vanish without being recorded. A technique can be rediscovered centuries later and celebrated as new. We see this even in our own era, when languages disappear, when artisanal skills decline, when entire technologies become unreadable because their supporting systems are gone. So the ancient battery becomes less a scandal and more a parable. It reminds us that progress is not a straight staircase. It is a landscape with ridges and valleys, with inventions that flourish and inventions that wither. Some knowledge spreads like fire, some stays small, like a candle in a back room, and goes out without anyone noticing. And then, when we stumble upon the remains, we are left with a choice: to turn it into proof of a grand secret, or to treat it as a quiet testament to human curiosity. Maybe that is the truest kind of wonder, not the idea that the past was impossibly advanced, but the idea that it was alive with the same restless intelligence we carry today. So when you look at a clay jar and imagine a spark, ask yourself, if the past could light even the faintest flame of electricity, what else might it have tried, only to lose it again? And if knowledge can vanish that easily, what are we losing right now without realizing it? There are places where the earth doesn't just hold history, it shelters it. In central Anatolia, the landscape looks almost playful. Soft volcanic stone, carved by wind into chimneys and cones, like a child's sandcastle left to harden. From a distance, it feels open, even whimsical. But if you step closer, you begin to notice the small, deliberate cuts in the rock. A doorway here, a narrow shaft there, a dark rectangle that swallows light. Then you descend. A staircase drops into cool air. The sound of the surface, birds, footsteps, the thin music of wind fades behind you. The stone changes texture under your hand. The passage tightens. You turn a corner and realize the underground is not a cave. It is a city. Rooms branch into corridors, storage chambers, sleeping quarters, spaces for animals, wells, kitchens, ventilation shafts that climb toward the sky like the lungs of the earth, doors shaped like giant stone wheels that could be rolled into place to seal a passage from the inside. A layout designed not for a moment, but for endurance. The first time people describe such a place, they often reach for the same word: impossible. How could ancient people carve something this vast underground? How could they plan it? How could they live here, weeks, months, perhaps longer, without losing their minds? And then the second question arrives, quieter but sharper. Why did they need to? Because underground cities aren't built for comfort. They are built for fear. Fear of invasion. Fear of persecution. Fear of a world that can suddenly become unsafe. The underground becomes a form of architecture shaped by uncertainty, the blueprint of a life lived with one ear listening for danger. But the story becomes stranger when you consider how easily such places can slip out of collective awareness. An underground complex can be used for generations, then abandoned. Entrances collapse or are sealed. New settlements rise above it. The memory turns into rumor. The rumor turns into myth. And after a few centuries, people walk over it without knowing the floor beneath them is hollowed by ancestral hands. This is one of the truest meanings of hidden from humanity. Not that it was guarded by shadowy forces, but that time itself is an expert at covering tracks. And when the world rediscovers such a place, often by accident, during construction or renovation, the discovery feels like opening a forgotten chapter in a family Bible. The handwriting is familiar, but the story was never told to you. The underground city challenges a modern assumption that the past was lived mostly in the open. We imagine ancient people under open skies, building on hills, farming valleys, watching horizons. And of course they did. But they also hid. They engineered survival in ways we seldom picture because it complicates the tidy narrative of steady progress. It reminds us that history is not only innovation and art, but refuge. Not only triumph, but contingency. And there is a philosophical ache at the center of it. An underground city is proof that people once believed the surface world could not be trusted, that safety might require disappearing, that a home might need to be invisible. If you walk those corridors today, you feel the intimacy of it. The ceilings are low, the air is still. You imagine the sound of breathing in the dark, the careful rationing of light, the muffled cries of children quickly hushed. You imagine prayers spoken quietly so they wouldn't travel up the shafts. You also imagine something else, resilience, because to carve a city underground is to refuse erasure. It is to insist we will live anyway, even if living must happen in secret, even if the sun is a risk. So when we call these places lost, we should be careful. They were not only lost to history, they were sometimes intentionally hidden from it, kept as an emergency heartbeat beneath ordinary life. And that raises a question that doesn't stay underground. What other forms of human genius have we overlooked because they were born not from ambition, but from the need to endure? And if our ancestors could build entire worlds beneath their feet, what does that say about the worlds we might be living above, unseen, unconsidered, and waiting for someone to notice the hollow places in our certainty? There's a particular kind of silence that follows fire. Not the immediate roar, the panic, the crackle, the collapsing beams, but the aftermath. The ash settling like grey snow. The smell that clings to stone. The feeling that something more than wood has been burned. Because fire doesn't just consume buildings. It consumes continuity. For centuries, one of the most enduring symbols of lost knowledge has been a library, real, legendary, or somewhere in between. A place where scrolls and texts were gathered, copied, argued over, and preserved. A place where human thought tried to outlast human bodies. And then, in the stories we tell, it burns. The burning library has become shorthand for everything fragile about civilization. How easily the record of who we were can vanish. How a single disaster, war, accident, negligence, can erase generations of learning and leave behind only rumors of what was written. This is where the legend of hidden discoveries becomes less about artifacts and more about absence. Because the most haunting discoveries are sometimes the ones we can't make, the books we can't read, the maps we can't unfold, the experiments we can't replicate because the notes are gone. There are accounts in history of texts described by those who saw them, then lost. There are mentions of catalogues, lists of titles, hints of disciplines, astronomy, medicine, engineering, philosophy, whose full content no longer exists in the surviving record. Whether every claim about such libraries is accurate is a question for scholars. But the broader truth is undeniable. The ancient world produced far more writing than we possess today. Paper rots, papyrus turns to dust, ink fades, shelves collapse, mice chew, floods rise, empires fall, and sometimes the people who inherit the ruins don't understand the language of what they find. A library can disappear without a single villain. It can vanish through the slow erosion of attention. Yet the myth of the hidden library persists, because it answers a longing that feels almost physical, the desire to believe that somewhere the missing pages are still there. In some stories, the texts were moved into tunnels before the flames reached them. In others, they were sealed in jars, buried in caves, hidden in monasteries, smuggled across seas. In the most romantic versions, the library was never truly destroyed, only relocated, guarded, waiting for a future generation to be worthy of its contents. It's a comforting thought. That knowledge is not lost, only postponed. But even if the grand library legends are exaggerated, the world has repeatedly proven that smaller versions of the miracle do happen. Manuscripts discovered in deserts, scrolls recovered from ash, inscriptions found in places no one expected to look, caches of texts that survived because a jar was sealed, a cave was dry, a wall remained intact. These moments don't restore everything. They restore enough to remind us how much is missing. And the missing has power. When we don't know what was written, we fill the gap with possibility. We imagine lost sciences and philosophies that could have changed history. We imagine alternate paths, medical knowledge advanced earlier, astronomical insights shared wider, ethical frameworks adopted sooner. We imagine, in other words, a world where human suffering might have been lessened if our knowledge had survived. That's why the burning library hurts even those who never lived near it. It feels like a collective amputation, not only of texts, but of potential. But here is the more difficult insight. Knowledge is not only stored in libraries. It is stored in institutions, in apprenticeships, in communities, in the habits of daily life. A society can lose its books and keep its skills for a while, or keep its books and lose the living practice that makes them meaningful. So the question becomes more personal. If a library burns, what disappears first? The facts, or the sense that we are part of a long conversation? Because when the record breaks, each generation is forced to reintroduce itself to the world, as if waking with partial memory. We reinvent what was already known. We argue old debates as if they are new. We repeat mistakes, not because we are foolish, but because the warnings were written in a language we no longer speak. In that light, The idea of a hidden library is not only about ancient scrolls. It is a wish for continuity, a belief that somewhere the conversation was preserved intact. And perhaps the most human question this story leaves us with is this: if the past could speak to us directly through words rescued from ash, would it change how we live now? Or would we simply build new libraries, confident they will last, forgetting that the most dangerous fire is often the one we don't notice until the smoke has already filled the room? Sometimes the mystery isn't that something was lost. It's that something was found and then slipped away again. Picture a shipment arriving at a museum. Crates, paperwork, the careful choreography of acquisition. Inside, artifacts wrapped in old newspaper, tagged with fading ink. Objects that once lay in soil now lie in human hands, suddenly dependent on climate control and catalog numbers to survive the modern world. We like to imagine that once an artifact is discovered, it's safe. That discovery is a kind of salvation, but the truth is more fragile. Collections move, funding dries up, institutions merge or collapse, wars redraw borders, political upheavals change what can be shown, what can be studied, what can be kept. Sometimes objects are stolen outright. Sometimes they are misplaced, a word that sounds gentle until you realize it can mean gone forever, with no clear record of where the trail ended. In the legends of hidden archaeology, there is often a recurring motif: the vanishing find. An excavation report mentions something astonishing. A photograph appears. A newspaper writes a short article. Then the object disappears from public view. No follow-up study, no exhibition, no peer-reviewed analysis, only repetition. People, quoting people, until the missing artifact becomes almost holy, untouchable, precisely because it cannot be checked. From the outside, disappearance looks like intention, like suppression. Sometimes it is. More often, it is the messy reality of human systems. The past does not enter a clean laboratory when it is unearthed. It enters a world of budgets, egos, politics, and paperwork. It enters a market where ancient objects can be worth fortunes, where temptation is constant and accountability imperfect. And even when no crime occurs, loss can happen quietly. A label falls off, a storage room floods, a curator retires with knowledge in their head that was never fully written down. A collection is transferred during renovations, and a few crates end up in the wrong place. An object is deaccessioned and sold, legally, into private hands where it becomes invisible to scholarship. The public tends to treat museums as vaults of certainty. But museums are also living organisms. They have blind spots. They have histories. They carry the fingerprints of their time. There's a particular ache in thinking about an artifact disappearing into private ownership because it turns history into property. It means the story of humanity, something that belongs, in a moral sense, to everyone, can be reduced to a commodity owned by a few. And yet, the ethical terrain is complicated. Many artifacts in major institutions were collected under colonial conditions. Many were removed from their origin communities without consent. For some nations and peoples, the return of artifacts is not a loss, but a restoration of dignity. So when we hear that something vanished, we have to ask, vanished from where? From whose view? From which narrative? Sometimes the artifact hasn't vanished at all. It has returned home. It has moved into another archive. It sits in a university collection, unglamorous but safe. Or it exists in a language barrier, documented in a local report that never gets translated, never enters the global conversation. But sometimes the simplest answer is the hardest. It is gone. And in that absence, the imagination returns to fill the hole. The vanishing artifact becomes a symbol of everything we fear about knowledge, that it is always vulnerable, always subject to gatekeepers, always one accident away from erasure. You can feel this fear when people talk about hidden discoveries. Beneath the speculation is a moral demand. The past should not be owned by secrecy. It should not be kept behind locked doors. It should be shared, studied, argued over in public light. That demand is not childish. It's democratic. It's a call for intellectual commons. But the real world is uneven. Some discoveries are controlled for protection. Some are restricted for legitimate reasons. Some are withheld because of political tension. And some are simply trapped in the slow machinery of institutions that are underfunded and overwhelmed. So what do we do with the vanishing story? We can become cynical, assuming every absence is a cover-up, or we can become naive, assuming every institution is flawless. Neither stance is wise. A more mature approach is to hold two truths at once, that the past is precious and vulnerable, and that humans, being human, do not always care for precious things as they should. Maybe the most haunting thing about a missing artifact is not what it proves, but what it reveals about us, how easily we lose what we claim to value. And that leaves a question that cuts deeper than any legend. If our civilization is judged one day by what survives of us, which parts will we protect with fierce attention, and which parts will we let slip into the dark, mislabeled and forgotten, simply because we were too busy to notice what we were losing? There's a moment in every excavation when the earth stops being ground and becomes a sentence. A line of stone appears where there should be none. A pattern repeats. A wall emerges, too straight to be natural. And suddenly, the shovel is no longer a tool of labor. It becomes a tool of translation. Some of the most persistent, hidden discovery stories orbit around megaliths, massive stones, shaped, moved, and placed with a confidence that feels almost personal. We photograph them and call them monuments, but standing near one is different. You feel the weight not only in your eyes, but in your bones. How did they move this? The question is old. It's asked at pyramids, temples, terraces, and ancient gates. It's asked in Peru, Egypt, the Levant, the Mediterranean, South Asia, and beyond. It's asked because the stones can look like they were fitted with a precision that suggests either advanced technique or an attention so intense it begins to look like magic. When an enormous stone sits on another stone with barely a seam, the modern mind reaches for modern explanations. Cranes, laser levels, power tools. Without them, it feels impossible. But impossible is often just the name we give to skills we don't yet understand. Ancient builders had geometry. They had levers and rollers. They had rope and sledges. They had water and sand and friction and patience. They had thousands of hands working in coordinated rhythm. They had time, generations of it, when the project mattered enough. Still, there are sites where the engineering questions remain sharp, not because we can't imagine any method, but because the scale pushes the limits of our certainty. Some stones are so heavy that even modern machines would treat them with respect. Some placements seem to require choices we can't easily reverse engineer. And when a site appears partially built and then abandoned, the unfinished work becomes its own puzzle. Why stop? This is where the hidden element often creeps in. People begin to suggest missing techniques, lost methods for softening stone, for lifting without visible ramps, for cutting with tools we haven't found. The absence of a clear method becomes proof of a missing chapter. But the deeper truth may be simpler and more unsettling. The chapter might not be missing. We might be overlooking it because it's boring. Labor is boring to modern storytelling. Organization is boring. Incremental refinement is boring. We crave a single secret, a single device, a single revelation that explains everything. Yet the ancient world was built mostly by the unglamorous virtues: persistence, measurement, training, and the collective will to make something that outlasts individual lives. And still, standing before certain stones, you can't help but feel the edge of mystery. Not the cheap kind, the honest kind. Because even if we can propose plausible methods, we don't always know which method was used at which site, in which era, by which people, under which constraints. The past does not come with instruction manuals. It comes with results. A megalith is a result. It is a final answer, carved into the landscape, offered without explanation. That silence is part of its power. It forces us to confront the limits of our reconstruction. It reminds us that our ancestors were not simple. They were different. They lived with constraints we don't share and freedoms we've forgotten. Freedoms like time, like communal labor, like the ability to commit to a project that would never benefit the builder personally. So perhaps the secret of the megaliths is not a lost machine, but a lost mindset, a willingness to think in centuries, a tolerance for effort that does not need to be efficient in the modern sense, a belief that meaning is worth weight. And that raises a question that feels uncomfortably modern. If the greatest works of the past were built by people who accepted the slow, heavy cost of permanence, what does it say about our era when we build so much that is light, fast, disposable, and then call it progress? There are discoveries that don't threaten our timelines. They threaten our pride, not because they suggest lost super technology, but because they suggest something quieter and harder to admit, that ancient minds sometimes understood the world with a subtlety we've underestimated. Consider the sky. Most of us live under it without looking up for more than a few seconds at a time. We know the weather app, the satellite image, the glow of city lights that hides the stars. We've outsourced the heavens to devices, but for most of human history, the sky was not background. It was instruction. It measured seasons. It predicted floods. It guided travelers. It structured rituals. It offered a calendar written in light. So when archaeologists find alignments, stones pointing to solstices, temples framing equinox dawns, markers that track the moon's strange cycle, the discovery is not merely aesthetic, it is intellectual. It tells us that people without telescopes watched the heavens closely enough to notice patterns that require years of attention to confirm. It tells us they cared enough to bake those patterns into architecture, into civic space, into sacred geometry. And then comes the question that fuels so many hidden narratives. How did they know? Sometimes the answer is simple. They watched and remembered and passed down the knowledge. A culture can carry an astronomical tradition the way a family carries recipes, through repetition, through apprenticeships, through stories that are also data. But sometimes the precision makes the modern mind uneasy. We want to say it must have come from somewhere else, some outside intervention, some lost scientific institution, a hidden handbook. It's a familiar pattern. When we see intelligence in the past, we rush to disown it. Yet the past keeps leaving clues that insist on dignity. There are ancient sites where the sun's path is captured with breathtaking exactness, where stone apertures allow a single beam of light to pierce a chamber on one day of the year, like a cosmic fingerprint, where shadow and angle were treated as instruments, where the sky was not only worshipped, but measured. These discoveries aren't hidden by design. They are hidden by habit. We moderns are trained to look at ancient monuments as art or religion or tourism. We are less trained to look at them as scientific devices. We forget that for ancient societies, science and spirituality were not always separate. Studying the sky could be both practical and sacred. Calculating the year could be both agriculture and prayer. So when we uncover a calendar temple, we are not just finding a building. We are meeting a worldview in which knowledge is embodied, in which the body standing in a doorway at sunrise becomes part of the measurement. There is also a darker undercurrent to this story: knowledge as power. If a community could predict seasons, they could predict hunger. They could organize planting. They could hold authority. A priesthood that knows when the sun will return might be seen as mediators between humans and gods, even if the knowledge was earned through careful observation. So the secrets of the sky were not always shared equally. Some were guarded, not because they were supernatural, but because they were socially valuable. That's another way discoveries become hidden, not buried, not lost, but held within certain hands. And it's easy to see echoes of that today. We live in a world where information is everywhere and yet unevenly understood, where knowledge is accessible and yet concentrated, where expertise can feel like a wall to those outside it. When people hear about ancient astronomical sophistication, some feel awe, others feel suspicion. They ask, what else are we not being told? But perhaps the more generous response is humility. The sky belongs to everyone, and yet it rewards those who watch. Ancient observers watched, and their stones still point upward, reminding us that intelligence does not require electricity. It requires attention. So here's the reflection that lingers after you stand in a shadow-lined passage and watch a single beam of sunlight strike its target. If our ancestors could build monuments that functioned as calendars, compasses, and cosmic diaries, what knowledge are we losing today? Not because it is secret, but because we no longer have the patience to look up long enough to learn it. There are stories the earth keeps because it has no choice, and there are stories people keep because they decide to. Sometimes, the most unsettling hidden discoveries are not stone chambers or crystal carvings, but bones, quiet evidence shaped like us. A skeleton doesn't argue, it doesn't persuade. It simply exists, carrying measurements, scars, density, and age like a ledger. That's why claims about anomalous human remains have such power. A skull that looks unusual. A bone found in a layer that seems too old. A burial that suggests a ritual we didn't expect. A skeleton that appears taller than typical for its time. A set of remains that doesn't fit neatly into the categories we've learned. Modern human, archaic human, something in between. These stories often arrive already heated because they touch the question we guard most closely. Who are we? The public imagination tends to leap in one of two directions. Either the remains are proof of a missing branch of humanity, giants, hybrids, lost peoples erased from mainstream history, or they are proof that the scientific establishment is hiding the truth. The reality, most often, is more complicated and more interesting. Human variation is wide. Pathology can change bone shape dramatically. Nutrition can affect height. Genetics can create features that look extraordinary when seen out of context. Decomposition and mineralization can distort measurements. Early investigators, working with limited methods, Sometimes misclassified remains and later corrections can feel like cover-ups to those who never saw the original uncertainty. But there are also genuine discoveries that expanded our understanding of what it meant to be human. New species proposed, populations identified through DNA, migrations traced across continents, lineages that overlapped, interbred, and vanished. In other words, the human story is already stranger than the old textbook version. So why do the hidden bones legends persist? Because bones carry emotional weight beyond data. They are the closest thing to a mirror the past can offer. When we see human remains, we don't just see evidence. We see a person who once had hands that held, eyes that watched, a voice that spoke into the air and is now gone. And when that person doesn't fit our expectations, the discomfort turns into story. Sometimes institutions do restrict access to remains, sometimes for ethical reasons, to respect descendant communities, to prevent exploitation, to avoid turning human bodies into spectacle, sometimes for legal reasons, sometimes because the remains are fragile and need preservation, sometimes because the research is ongoing and premature conclusions could cause harm. To an outsider, that restriction can look like secrecy, but it can also be stewardship. Still, the tension is real. We want openness, and we want respect. We want evidence, and we want dignity. We want the past to be knowable, and we want the dead to be treated as more than objects. That moral complexity is part of what makes archaeology feel like a human science in the deepest sense. It's not only about what we find, it's about how we behave while finding it. There is another layer to the hidden remains stories, the way certain myths have been used historically to justify power. Tales of giant races and lost superior peoples have sometimes been twisted to support dangerous ideologies. Even when modern storytellers don't intend that, the echoes linger. So a responsible narrative must walk carefully. It must treat anomalous claims as possibilities to investigate, not as trophies to wield. Because the goal is not to prove a sensational conclusion. The goal is to understand the complexity of being human across time. And perhaps that is the truest lesson bones can teach, that we have always been varied, adaptive, and not easily reduced to a single story. So when you hear about a skeleton that doesn't fit, resist the easy temptation to decide what it means before the evidence is weighed. Instead, ask, are we looking for the truth of the past, or are we looking for a version of the past that flatters our modern hunger for mystery, even if it risks turning real human lives into legends? There is a kind of loss that doesn't happen through destruction, but through renaming. A site exists. People know it, they build around it, live beside it, tell stories about it. Then a new authority arrives, a new border, a new language, a new religion, a new political need. The site is reclassified. It becomes something else. It is restored, reinterpreted, repurposed, or simply ignored until it dissolves into landscape. This is how the past can be hidden without ever being buried. Not by a secret society, but by ordinary human priorities. In the modern imagination, hidden archaeology often means something sealed underground. But some of the most profound hiding happens in plain sight. A temple becomes a fortress. A sacred spring becomes a tourist landmark. A shrine becomes a ruin. A ruin becomes just stones. And when meaning shifts, memory shifts with it. There are countless examples across the world where older layers lie beneath newer ones. Literally, yes, but also culturally. Cities built atop cities, roads laid over older roads, walls rebuilt with stones pulled from earlier monuments. The recycling is practical. It's also symbolic. Each era builds its narrative on the physical remains of the last. Sometimes the hidden discovery is simply the recognition that what we thought a site was is not what it began as. A fortress might have started as a sacred enclosure. A palace might have been a temple. A mound might contain successive lives stacked like rings in a tree trunk. When archaeologists peel back those layers, the revelation can feel like a betrayal of the familiar story. And that's when resistance appears, because heritage is identity, and identity does not like revision. This is where the tension between discovery and doubt becomes most human. It's easy to think of archaeology as neutral science, but it exists inside cultures that care deeply about what the past says. A new interpretation can shift narratives of belonging. It can change tourism economies. It can challenge political myths. It can awaken old grievances. So some discoveries are not hidden by a single villain, but by the collective discomfort of change. A site can be left unexcavated because digging would reopen trauma, or because the living community doesn't want outsiders disturbing it, or because the state fears what competing interpretations might ignite, or because funding is directed elsewhere, towards stories that sell more cleanly. And then there is the quietest kind of hiding: neglect. A world full of wonders also has limited attention. The past is vast, and resources are finite. 1,000 sites crumble, while a handful become famous. Entire regions hold histories that remain understudied because they are remote, politically unstable, or simply unfashionable in academic circles. This isn't a conspiracy, it's triage, but the result can look like erasure. So the final chapter before our conclusion is not about one artifact, one chamber, one device. It's about the larger phenomenon that threads through every hidden story we've explored. The way the past depends on the present to be seen. The past does not speak without translators, and translators are humans, carrying biases, incentives, fears, and hopes. That's why hidden from humanity is often a misleading phrase. It suggests the past is a locked box, and someone has the key. More often, the past is a landscape covered in fog. The fog isn't always intentional. Sometimes it's weather. Sometimes it's exhaustion. Sometimes it's politics. Sometimes it's grief. And sometimes it's simply time. So if we want a more mature relationship with hidden discoveries, we have to accept that truth is not only found, it is maintained, it is funded, it is protected, it is argued for, it is taught. Which means the real mystery is not only what lies beneath the earth. The real mystery is what we choose to care about enough to uncover. And that brings us to a final, unsettling question. If the future digs through the ruins of our era, what will they conclude we valued, based not on what we said, but on what we preserved? And what will they never find, because we allowed it to vanish in plain sight? By the time you reach the end of a story like this, something strange happens. The mysteries you began with, the void under the pyramid, the rumor beneath the Sphinx, the artifact sealed in stone, the crystal skull's cold perfection, the clay jar that might hold a spark, the underground city breathing in darkness, the library that burns in our imagination, the vanished collection, the megaliths that refuse to explain themselves, the sky mapped in stone, the bones that don't fit, the sites rewritten by new names start to feel less like separate puzzles. They feel like one question told in many dialects. What is the past, really? Not the past as a museum label, but the past as a living relationship between what happened and what we can prove. between what we can measure and what we can only sense, between the world as it was and the story we tell ourselves about it. If you came into this journey hoping for a single grand secret, one hidden chamber that would flip history like a coin, then the ending may feel quieter than you expected, because the honest conclusion is not a dramatic reveal. It is a kind of humility. The past is not a locked room with one key. It is a vast landscape with countless doors, many of which open only a little at a time. Some doors are blocked by ethics, some by politics, some by money, some by time, some by the simple fact that evidence decays faster than curiosity can chase it. And yet, we keep chasing. Why? Because hidden discoveries aren't only about what was buried. They're about what can still be found, about the possibility that the world contains more meaning than the version we've memorized. When people say they're hiding something, sometimes what they mean is, I don't want the story to be over. I don't want history to be settled. I want the universe to remain capable of surprise. That desire is not foolish. It's the engine of learning. But learning has a cost. It requires us to tolerate uncertainty. It asks us to hold wonder without turning it into certainty. It asks us to admit that some questions remain open, not because of malice, but because reality is complicated. And there is another cost, quieter but just as important, responsibility. Because the past is not a toy for our imagination. It is made of real human lives, people who loved, feared, worked, sacrificed, and died. Their artifacts are not props. Their bones are not symbols. Their cities are not just backdrops for our modern thirst for mystery. They deserve care. So the most ethical way to approach hidden discoveries is to move slowly, to ask for evidence, to welcome correction, to treat speculation as possibility, not proof, to resist the thrill of accusations, to honor complexity. This isn't a dull conclusion, it's a radical one, in an age that rewards certainty, and it leads to a final insight that ties every chapter together. The greatest hidden discovery is not a device or a chamber. It's the realization that history is not something we possess. It's something we participate in. Every generation curates the past. We decide what to dig, what to fund, what to display, what to return, what to protect, what to ignore. We decide which voices survive in textbooks and which remain in the dust of archives. We decide whether knowledge is a commons or a commodity. In that sense, the past is always being hidden and revealed at the same time, by the choices we make now. So if you want a timeless question to carry with you after the music fades and the final image dissolves, let it be this. What kind of ancestors do we want to be? Not in the sentimental sense, but in the practical one. What will we preserve? What will we study with patience? What will we allow to be lost because it's inconvenient, unprofitable, or simply hard? Because one day, someone will stand at the edge of our ruins, whether they are made of stone, steel, or data, and they will ask the same question we ask today. What's underneath? And the answer will depend, in part, on whether we treated truth as a possession or as a shared human responsibility, carried forward like a fragile flame through time.